have decided to speak on the policy research and adequacy to elevate poverty of excluded group in India. Although I will deal with the issue of poverty in general, but at the end the more focus will be what does it take to influence policy for positive outcome. I think that is the key thing. When I listened to the earlier presentation from Norway, you could see that the entire thing ends with communications and all strategies, but whether those research and communication, whether it has converted into policy decision by the government or not, we do not know. What I will discuss, focus is the second aspect more. Well, the scheme of presentation is going to be something like this: excluded and indigenous group and nature and source of their poverty. I will focus on some international experience, but detailed discussion on India. Explain and present the research on poverty and policy by Indian Institute of Dalit Study. Nidhi Dana has made a detailed presentation, but I won't go into that detail now. Then the discrimination and exclusion and its consequences on poverty, poverty engagements of IIDS, and then I'll discuss with you two case studies, which will indicate the element of successful policy solution outcomes, and if they are of any use to us. I think those are some of those lessons that I would like to share with you. Policy research and general research differences. Let me begin by saying that there is a difference between the policy research and the general research, which we need to keep in mind. Policy research provides decision maker and communities with a useful recommendation for resolving the fundamental or problems on our hand. It is linked to the public policy agenda, government or private sector, and action on their part. I think that is the difference. Focus on issues on our hand and alternative policy option for dealing with them. Now, general research, on the other hand, is focused on exploring the phenomena and understanding the reality through scientific methods. The purpose may not be finding out the solution to the problem. It is a different matter that general research may have policy implications, which needs consideration. But I think the difference between the general research and the policy research is that one is more focused, policy research is more focused on issues for which we are looking for a solution and action on the part of the decision-making authority. Now, there are a large number of researchers in the university who undertake fundamental research, good research, but there are those like us, we are sitting perhaps here, who do more policy research and the action research. What motivates researcher for policy research? I tried to ask this question to myself. Now, motive may differ, but I realize at the end that the most important among them is the desire for positive change and transformation through policies and policy advocacy. There is inner desire that there is something wrong. People are poor, they are under malnutrition, they are illiterate, and they need to be changed. But we take a route of the research, try to understand the problem, try to suggest the solution, and try to bring out some positive changes in society. So I think that is the main motivation that perhaps motivate all of us to go for a policy research as against the general research. And I have seen in my country that emergence of many research institutes, or what we call think tanks, outside the university system, or even for that matter programs, research program in the universities, the different platforms that we have discussed, are generally focused on the specific issues and the theme in their research, and try to find solution for actions, as against the general research which goes in the university where it may not be focused. Now, let me come to the issues that I am going to discuss with you. Poverty and discriminated group. This is not to say that I am not talking about the poverty of the non-discriminated one, but I would like to focus on this because this is an issue which has came for a discussion recently also. and that my institute focuses on that issue more prominently. Well, friend, I participate in a panel discussion only in the World Bank on 9th, 2013, couple of days before, on the occasion of release of World Bank report, Inclusion Matters. After a long gap of several decades, now World Bank recognized two things. One, that poor are not a heterogeneous group, and one such heterogeneity is between excluded group and the rest. So poor is not a homogeneous category. Within the poor there are groups, and their problems are similar but also differed from each other, and therefore solutions are different. Poverty of excluded community is high and persistent in many countries. That is another recognition, that there are poor which are from non-excluded group. Their poverty continue to decline, but the poverty of excluded group also declined, but it remained very high. So there is a certain element of chronicity to the poverty of excluded group. And then there is a recognition by the report that the excluded group lag behind because of social exclusion, discrimination, and denial of equal access to resources and rights due to cultural identity, which others do not suffer from. So this is an additional disadvantage of excluded group, that they are denied equal right which others enjoy because of their group identity, which other poor do not enjoy, do not suffer. That is why their mobility out of poverty trap is relatively faster than that of excluded group. The report observed, and I am reading it for simple reason, I will give the reason, that development investment produce unequal benefit. Group with certain distinguished characteristics consistently fail to benefit from nation's progress. These groups were among the poorest in the nation. What sets them apart was that they were members of excluded group, indigenous people, new immigrant people with disabilities, and people with different skin color, people who spoke the official language imperfectly. These are people branded by stigma, stereotype, and superstition. They confront unique barriers that keep them from full participation in country's political and economic life. They are excluded. This is also a part of the quotation. Now, the report goes on further, who get excluded and how, and report observed that individual and groups are excluded or included based on their identity. Among the common identities resulted in exclusions are gender, race, caste, ethnicity, religion, and disability status. Social exclusion based on such group attribute can lead to lower social standing, often accompanied by a lower outcome in terms of income, human capital empowerment, access to employment and services, and voice in national and local decision making. Gap between the attainment of male and female in range of outcomes are well documented. People of African descent are still excluded in varieties of culture. Now, why I have given this in a little detailed way, this report, which is released on 13th of this month, 9th of this month, is that the World Bank seems to have come a long way from its earlier position. If you recall, in the 60s and the 70s, the World Bank position based on neoclassical economics and largely the work by Kuznets was governed by the fact that let there be a growth in the income as fast as possible, and through the trickle-down mechanism it will reach to the poor. So eradication of poverty was considered to be through the trickle-down mechanism by higher growth rate. So the focus was growth. In the 80s, we realized that the countries, in particular in Latin America and other countries, there was growth, but there was no decline in poverty of substantial nature. And then we changed it. That what matters is not only growth alone, but there are certain underlying considerations which also matter for a trickle-down mechanism. Now, more recently, in 2000, World Bank has moved away a little more from the type of growth to what is called inclusive growth. And the pro-poor growth is a major component of inclusive growth. So the current thinking in the World Bank, which influences every country, in fact, the plan in my country is influenced by the thinking in the World Bank. So current thinking is that growth is important, but the type of growth is equally important. The type of growth that increase the capability and income of the poor is important. And therefore, now the development is being judged not by increasing the income, which is very necessary, of course, that is the precondition, but whether that increase in income is leading to outcome in terms of increasing the income of the poor, so that reduction in the poverty, increase in the educational level, reduction in the mortality rate, increase in the longevity. So we are more judging the Human Development Report or MGD's goal that we are talking about are the outcome variable on which now we focus more. So I think this change is very important. But the report, the abstract that I have given to you is the most latest change in the attitude of the World Bank as far as the development strategy is concerned, that the type of growth and the outcome in some of the human development indicators were still thought at the aggregate level. This disaggregation by social group, disaggregation by economic group did not figure very much. And it is for the first time that the World Bank recognized the fact that we have to disaggregate the poverty, we have to disaggregate the income and see that those who lag behind, they also benefit. And then they discover that social exclusion matter for the excluded group. Now, as far as India is concerned, the report observed, and I am again quoting, the caste system, particularly in India and Nepal, stand out as an ideal type of exclusion, complete with an ideology and hierarchy that persisted throughout millennia. Religion continues to be a serious driver of exclusion. And indigenous peoples are another group which also suffered from social isolation and physical isolation. Now, let me in this background then share with you the research and policy engagement of the institute that I belong. The focus is on large majority of the excluded group, but these are the two groups which we have a reasonable statistic and which are recognized by the government for the policy purposes, namely the untouchable, or they are called scheduled caste in the legal language, account about 16%, and the indigenous population or tribal or scheduled tribe account about 80%. So close to 1/4 of India's population is accounted by these two groups whose poverty is the highest. Now, therefore, the IIDS undertook research on poverty of these three groups, and I will try to explain my personal engagement as well as the institutional engagement. The main studies that we have done so far, which have brought out the poverty by disaggregated group, studies on poverty and human development. This was done for UNDP. For the first time, UNDP asked us to prepare a human development index, which was very difficult, by disaggregated group for scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and average. And it brings out that this group lag behind. Then I will discuss with you the nature of discrimination faced by them, policy engagement, and some successes. I am giving the scheme. Now, let me tell you, because the focus is on what matters and what counts for positive outcome of policy engagement. I think it has lot to do with motivation also. And therefore, let me share very briefly with you my personal encounter and my engagement with the research, policy research, and then I will come to the institute. My research generally focus on number of issues, but poverty of excluded group is central. And the motivation was that the village in which I stayed for 20 years or 30 years back and forth affected and motivated me to raise certain questions in 50s and the 70s. The discriminated group of untouchable in the villages lives physically and socially in a segregated locality, limited access to village public amenities, majority had no land, enterprises or business, mainly wage labor, illiterate, high poverty and malnutrition, and no power in local institution of governance. Now, these are the situation in which I grew and I have seen it. But at the same time, there was an anti-caste movement in the village in the 50s and the 60s, started by Dr. Ambedkar. His counterpart, I would say, is Martin Luther King here. And that anti-caste movement was to have an equal access to the amenities, well and temple in the villages. because the anti-discriminatory law to which Nidhi Sadhana has referred was passed since 1955, which provide equal access to everybody. And it is based on that the agitation was undertaken in the villages. And as a school-going student, I was a part of both of this experience, namely the discrimination as well as the village-level struggle for equal right. And these experiences later led to the search for answer to discrimination and high poverty. That consciousness which remained with me when I entered into the colleges in the university in 1964-73, came in contact with Dr. Ambedkar's literature, and this consciousness led me to ask question as a student. But I must, before I move on further, I must say that the agitation in the villages immediately led to the success, because there was a backing of the law. So untouchable were allowed to have an entry into the village temple, which was a public temple. Untouchable were allowed to have an access to well and the public road. Now, in the studies in to 2000, there were hardly any study of intergroup disparities, because National Sample Survey data, which is the major source of data in India, did not publish the statistic by social group. It did not allow. It is only in 1999 that the cabinet and the government took a decision to allow the unit level data, which led to the plethora of study on poverty by social group. But what I did was that there were reports which were prepared by the government for policy purposes. I collected those reports, which was lying in the libraries of the government with lot of dust on it, and I took them out and then made a beginning on the intergroup disparity between scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, in poverty, causes of poverty, in access to ownership of land, education, employment, and also did some studies. Now, some of the studies were done by the institute also, but some studies were done earlier. So these are the four major studies which became very known. I think one of which was that we did it for Chronic Poverty Institute. That was in 2008, I believe. Poverty rates were estimated. Then in 2010, very recently, this is the only paper which estimate poverty very in extensive manner by caste, ethnic group, and economic group. Then we prepare a paper for MGD 2008, review by social group, what was the status in India. And most recently, of course, we were asked to write an MGD by Overseas Development Institute for the post-2015 approach. What should be the approach toward the excluded group? Naila Kabir is heading that group, and Seffert is another economist from the Overseas Development Institute. Now, these are very prime studies which brings out the intergroup disparities in poverty. Now, as we go back, for example, that one of the characteristics that we find is that the poverty on this group is very high and that they lag behind. I just want to show you the table so that you can have some idea. This is the latest statistic. You have the social group. This is 2009-10. There is a debate about poverty, so don't go by the figure. Look at the relative position. The overall poverty is 21.6. For scheduled caste is 32. For scheduled tribe it is 30. For others it is just 17. For Hindus it is 21. For Muslim it is 25. And for other religious minorities 11. Now you can see the disparities in the poverty. The poverty of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe is certainly very high, but there is it goes down. It is much lower among the others. Muslim also it is relatively high. If you see the change between 1993 and 2010, I have not mentioned the year, but this 16-year period, you can see the rate of decline in poverty among the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe is lower, 2.1, 2.4, compared to 2.6 for others, or 3.4 for other religious minorities, or overall average of 2.5. So this tells you the story that in terms of level of poverty as well as rate of change, the discriminated group lag behind compared to their counterpart from the other group. Now, another task that before us was in this institute, when this institute was set up, that why is it that the poverty of excluded group is high and that it decline at a slower rate? And Nidhi has given you the detailed account of study, but I'll briefly mention that our hypothesis was that the discrimination in the market and non-market institution and even government scheme provide a less access to the excluded group as compared to their poor counterpart from the higher caste, and as a result, they don't have access to sources which determine poverty, and it is there we had to examine, and therefore we took number of studies. We studied the economic discrimination in agricultural land market, labor market, input market for the farmer, and the discrimination in sale of the farm and non-farm out product. We generally come with a conclusion that the scheduled caste farmer do face discrimination in having access to labor market, having access to land, having access to input that are required in the agriculture, and they have a difficulty in sale of farm output, particularly milk and vegetable, which are consumable because untouchables are considered to be polluting, so a consumable atom they have a difficulty in selling. I do not want it to go. It will suffice to say that in some areas there is no discrimination, there is open access, but there are areas where they face discrimination, and as a result, it has its impact, which I will share with you later. Now, similar story is in non-market institutions, that is the education institution, school and higher education, primary health center, and the agency which supply food on a cheap rate. In all three of these institutions, we discover that they face discriminatory access. As a result, the access level is low and it affects their situation. Government scheme, we have studied about 7 government schemes and see that there is a disparities in access to various government schemes. It's employment, health, education, nutrition for children, health for women, which has been described by Nidhi Sudhana in the morning. So on the whole, I would only submit that notwithstanding that there is an open access, they face discrimination, experience discrimination. As a result, it affects their utilization level and the access to sources of income. Now, these studies indicate that the excluded and indigenous group are more poor than their counterpart from non-excluded group. More poor among them are wage laborer in rural and urban area. Most poor are also from the rural area, and that during this period, 1993 and 1910, the poverty in their case has declined at a lower rate compared to others. What are the consequences? I think this is the most difficult job for us. I just want to share with you, deviate with you, that the study of discrimination, social and cultural discrimination, there are studies, as Nidhi has rightly pointed out, because there is a law. But study of economic discrimination, market discrimination is completely absent in Indian mainstream literature. When we began, we had a difficulty. And therefore, when I spent 2 years here in Iowa State University, I collected this entire literature, Gary Becker and Arrow's theory of economic discriminations and several other literature, and applied those concepts and used those concepts to the institution of caste and untouchability. So we had to make a beginning from the scratch, not in terms of concept alone, but in terms of method of measurements and developing a questionnaire, and then trying to point out what is the impact. The impact that has emerged, and theoretically we can argue, that labor market discrimination in hiring and wage led to lower employment, higher unemployment rate, and lower wage earning. Some statistic was given in the morning. Discrimination in access to assets lead to low ownership of agricultural land and private entrepreneurship, and therefore it results into wage labor, high wage labor. The scheduled caste accounts 65% of wage labor at the level of all India. Of the total household belonging to the scheduled caste, 65% are wage laborer. Only rest of them own some sort of an asset. Farmer, low access to farm input lead to low productivity and low farm income. Non-market institution, low education level and skill and low employability. Poor health, if there is a discrimination in the primary health centers. Low access to food, if they face discrimination and differential treatment in the fair price shop. And of course, in government service, their utilization level will not be as high as of others. Now, these are some of the consequences which result into poverty. higher poverty. And I think the problem with the MGD approach, I will come to that, Million Development Approach of, with respect to excluded group in the earlier phase and the 2015 phase, is that this is not being captured. Even the report of the World Bank Inclusion Matter has also this problem, that it is not able to put its finger on the consequences because we don't know the mechanism. We must understand how discrimination reduce their access, and there are consequences, and therefore there will be a different set of policy. Now, we also then undertook the research on policies. Okay, sorry. We also took research on policies, and we based our understanding that you require general policies for employment, food, nutrition, asset, education. But for the excluded group, you require certain group-specific policy. And here precisely I have differences with the MGD strategy as well as the strategy proposed by the World Bank in this report, that the Indian government has, of course, developed this policy. The point is that you require a group-specific policy because excluded group face discrimination and differential treatment in the market when they go for access to employment and education and others. If they face differential access, you have to have a policies which will ensure them non-discriminatory access. And that there, the whole thing is being messed up. There is a whole debate in India, there is a whole debate here, that why not general policies? Why not everybody has a public school? Why not everybody has employment? Why do you need special treatment for the excluded group? Not realizing that even if we provide education to the excluded group, the possibility of they facing discrimination is high in the labor market, which the other poor would not face. So you require group-specific policy, but those group-specific policies should be such that they overcome discrimination and provide them equal access. How do you do that is an issue which has been tried by many countries. Now, I would like to very briefly then go through the engagement of the policy engagement of the IIDS. And but I will only focus, because of lack of time, I will give the two successful cases and then summarize. First is the affirmative action policy for the private sector. The affirmative action policy in India is a very comprehensive policy adopted in 1930s and 1950s, but private sector was excluded. And state sector was very big during the early period. When the privatization and liberalization policy came, the excluded group began to ask policies for the private, affirmative action policies for the private sector. I realized the importance, and I was the first one to write an article in 1994 pointing out the de-reservation of due to privatization. And then 2003 onward till 2012, we developed all this method. We took a research on labor market discrimination, because private sector would say that we don't discriminate, we respect merit, we provided evidence, research in labor market discrimination. Then advocacy through mass media, TV and newspaper, help civil society to organize campaign, studies for the concerned ministries, and finally the private sector accepted what is called voluntary and self-regulatory affirmative action policy in 2008. We made a review in 2012. Now this is a very successful policy outcome. There are many of them, but we are mentioning them, that we were the key player in this. Second is education. We undertook studies right in the beginning that there is a discrimination in the school and the higher education, segregated seating, which Nidhi Sadhana has shown through the pictures, and general neglect, and many other aspects of discrimination. We brought that out. Government won't listen to it. We brought out in 2007, 2009. And writing on discrimination, discussion with the ministry, it doesn't work. When there were 2 suicides by the Dalit student in All India Institute of Medical Sciences, then government approached IIDS to prepare a regulation against discrimination. They realized. So I will summarize at the end that it is very risky. Policy action is very risky. But finally now the government has passed the regulation against discrimination in the school for higher education and school education, and also ask us to help them to prepare the teachers training manual as to how teachers should teach in the class. Now, I think based on our experience, these I think are probably some of the element of successful policy action. One is identify the current problem and bring visibility through good research. Issue those are on the agenda of the government. Then you have a possibility of much success. Government looks for support and solution. Issue on the agenda of a private sector. Timely support to the policy maker. Close contact with the policy maker, but with a respectable difference, because then you are going to compromise. And more successful if the institute undertakes studies or head policy committees. We have seen that when I chair some of the committees, I discovered that my recommendations straightway went into the policy making. So these are some of the elements that we have learned which lead to the positive policy outcome. But final remark that positive policy outcome of research are marked with uncertainty and risk with no guarantees. Bottom line for high probability of positive outcome in my view is good quality research based on sound methodology acceptable to the mainstream academics, policy suggestion backed by sound empirical evidence, alternative policy and solution or option, so that government can, there is always a political economy of policies. So you give alternative solutions and then it's quite likely one of them might be accepted. Alternative policies and solution or options and constant advocacy. Policy research has its indirect impact on its public domain. Once it is placed in public domain, you may not know. One does not know who, where and when, how result will be used in one form or another. One doesn't know really. But one should continue to do research. And I can give you 3-4 examples where without any effort, our policies outcome were accepted. ILO accepted for the labor market discrimination, incorporated into their guidelines. DFID in fact developed a £25 million program on social exclusion and poverty. FAO, as Nidhi Sadana has suggested, pick up our paper on discrimination. I'll finish. And World Bank pick up our paper on malnutrition. We support NGO and we also support 32 research centers because there is a challenge. There are no studies around. I think I should stop it. Well, thank you very much.